Today, we're diving deep into the dark, incredible reality of one of history's most famous structures, the Roman Colosseum. Now, a lot of us just picture it as this ancient sports arena, right? A place of myth and legend. But the facts from our source material reveal something way more calculated. We're going to see how Rome used this colossal amphitheater not just as a stadium, but as its absolute loudest message to the world.
Think about this chilling idea for a second. Rome was basically broadcasting a message. We have the power, we have the money, and we can turn death into sheer entertainment. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was a highly effective, deliberate political strategy. The Roman Empire tapped into a profound psychological truth about human nature. They knew they needed a place where tens of thousands of everyday people could go to completely forget about their poverty, their politics, and their daily struggles. And by serving up a massive spectacle of blood, wild animals, and skilled warriors on the sand, the state handed them the ultimate distraction.
So, Rome's biggest message: death as entertainment. How exactly did they deliver this to the masses?
Well, just consider the unbelievable scale and speed of this project. Emperor Vespasian kicks off construction around 70 AD, and incredibly, his son Titus opens the doors just 10 years later in 80 AD. We're talking about an arena built 2 millennia ago that could hold tens of thousands of people, and they threw it up in a single decade. It immediately became the beating heart of Roman society, a monumental stage built for the exact purpose of hosting the empire's most captivating and brutal shows.
But to really get what these games were about, we have to peel back that architectural glamour and look at the men who actually fought on the sand. A true prisoner's countdown. Forget the Hollywood myth of the glorious willing hero. When you break down where these gladiators actually came from, the vast majority were completely forced into the arena. You had huge numbers of slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals. Only a tiny, tiny fraction were men who actually volunteered. And honestly, why did they volunteer? Because it offered a desperate, high-stakes chance at money, fame, and a tiny shot at freedom. But for almost everyone else on that sand, they were there because they literally had no choice.
If you compare a modern athlete's daily routine to a gladiator's, you realize we're talking about two entirely different universes. A modern athlete wakes up to optimize their performance and train for peak fitness. A gladiator's day started quite literally like a prisoner's countdown. Their daily life had absolutely nothing to do with sportsmanship. It was about sheer, desperate survival.
Before they ever even stepped foot in the Colosseum, these guys were locked up in places called Ludi. Now, we translate that to training schools, but that makes it sound way too academic. These were heavily guarded barracks. The men lived there and were rigorously conditioned to become professional killers. They were fed, housed, and trained for one exclusive purpose: public violence.
And the training? Visceral and absolutely brutal. Obviously, they practiced with swords, shields, nets, and spears, but here's the crazy part. They had to learn how to fall safely. They had to learn how to bleed calmly, without panicking. And crucially, they were taught how to entertain the screaming crowd while actively trying not to die. In Rome, simply winning the fight wasn't enough. You had to look brave doing it. The entertainment factor was just as important as the actual combat skill.
To squeeze every drop of entertainment out of this, the Romans engineered the games with horrifying bureaucratic precision. Let's look at this escalating schedule of death.
A typical day at the Colosseum was a masterclass in building tension. Morning rolls around and it kicks off with the animal hunts. And we're not talking about local wildlife. We mean lions, bears, leopards, elephants, even rhinos. Rome imported these exotic creatures from the furthest edges of their territory strictly to flux on the public. It was a message. If Rome can conquer nature and drag a rhino to the city, what can't we do? Then, at midday, the vibe got incredibly dark. That time was reserved for executing criminals and condemned prisoners, sometimes throwing them to wild animals or forcing them into brutal reenactments of myths. Finally, in the afternoon, the tension peaked with the main event, the gladiators.
And when the afternoon finally hit, the violence was anything but chaotic. It was a deadly game of balance.
These matchups were meticulously calculated. You wouldn't just throw two heavy guys with swords at each other. They engineered the fights to balance opposing strengths. On one side, you'd have a fighter packed with heavy armor, raw power, and a sword. On the other side, an opponent with almost no physical protection, armed only with a net and trident, relying completely on incredible speed and movement. It was always power against speed, armor against movement. This intentional imbalance meant the fights lasted longer, were way more thrilling, and kept the audience on the absolute edge of their seats.
Now zoom out from the sand for a second and think about the audience. The seating chart itself was a genius tool for social control. The rich elites, the senators, the nobles, They got the best seats, right down close to the action. Ordinary citizens sat higher up, and the poor, the women, the slaves, they were pushed way up to the nosebleeds at the very top. The entire social order of the Roman Empire was perfectly, physically mirrored in those stands. Everyone knew exactly where they belonged, and everyone showed up, because this was the greatest show on earth, all happening under the watchful eye of the emperor. His presence validated the whole bloody affair.
But to keep this massive machine running, Rome had to offer a glimmer of hope. This brings us to the ultimate trick, the illusion of freedom.
They made the fighters and the crowd buy into this idea of glory. If a gladiator actually fought well and survived, the rewards were insane. Immense fame, popularity, huge sums of money, and lavish gifts. If he captured the public's imagination, 50,000 people would chant his name. He'd have his face painted on city walls and be treated like an absolute celebrity walking down the streets of Rome.
But the absolute ultimate goal, the thing every fighter dreamed of, was the Rudus. It wasn't a weapon, it was a wooden sword given to a gladiator to symbolize that he had officially earned his freedom. But the grim, hidden reality of the spectacle was that very, very few men ever survived long enough to actually hold that wooden sword.
Because despite the fame, despite tens of thousands of people screaming your name, the fundamental truth of the gladiator comes down to 4 words: owned, trained, bought, and sold. These guys were not free. Their bodies were monetized by managers getting rich off their blood. Sure, some walked in chasing fame, but most were just trying to survive. And when a fighter fell, his final moments weren't even his own. The crowd shouted, the emperor gave a nod, and a human life was extinguished purely for public entertainment.
Which leaves us with a pretty terrifying realization about how authoritarian control actually works. Rome fed its people blood and told them it was a game. They offered fighters a taste of fame, but only after stripping away their basic freedom. As our sources brilliantly highlight, for a gladiator, the real victory was never about becoming a legend. It was simply walking out alive. It really forces us to ask a tough question. If an empire can so masterfully trade human freedom for public entertainment, distracting citizens from their real problems, what is the true price of the spectacles we consume today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this breakdown gave you a totally new lens for looking at history.